There is a coffee tin that still sits on the top shelf of our pantry, behind the flour and the extra dish towels, and I have not moved it since the funeral. It is an old Folgers can, the red kind with the plastic lid gone slightly warped from being opened and closed so many times, and for 34 years my husband dropped his loose change into it every single night before bed. Quarters, mostly, sometimes a stray dollar bill folded into a small, careful square, the way you'd fold something you meant to keep. He called it the vacation fund, though we never once used it for a vacation, and when I would ask him, laughing, when we were finally going to cash it in and go somewhere warm, he would look at me with that same patient, closed-off smile he wore for almost anything having to do with money, and he would say the same 6 words he said to me for over 3 decades. Trust me, there's no money. I believed him. That is the part I have had to sit with the longest, in the year and change since he died. Not that he lied to me, exactly, though in the strictest sense I suppose he did, but that I believed him so completely, for so long, that I built an entire quiet, careful, thrifty life around a scarcity that was never real. I want to tell this story in order, because I have come to think the order is the only way it makes any sense at all, and because for a long time I did not tell it to anyone, not fully, not even to myself. I am telling it now because I believe he would want me to. Though I confess I am not entirely certain of that either. There was a great deal about my husband I was not entirely certain of, it turns out, even after 36 years of marriage. That, in the end, is what this story is about. My name is Eleanor Kessler, Ellie, to everyone who has ever loved me, and I am 63 years old. I taught second grade for 31 years at Millbrook Elementary, in the small Pennsylvania town where I have lived my entire adult life. The kind of town where the hardware store still writes your name on a paper ledger if you're $1 short, and everyone at the diner knows how you take your coffee without being asked. I retired 4 years ago, 2 years before my husband passed, and in that strange, quiet stretch of early retirement, before I knew what I know now, I remember thinking we had finally reached the part of our life where things would ease, where the tight grip he kept on every dollar might loosen, just slightly, and we might take that trip to see the ocean he always said we'd take once things settled down. Things were never going to settle down enough for him. I understand that now, and I did not understand it then, and the distance between those two states of understanding is the whole of what I want to tell you tonight. Walter and I met at a church potluck in the fall of 1988, when I was 25 and newly arrived in Millbrook to take my first teaching job, and he was 28 and already known around town as the quiet Kessler boy who could fix anything with a motor in it. He ran a small auto repair shop on Route 9 that his father had started. A low brick building with a hand-painted sign that had faded to the color of weak tea, and Walter had taken it over 2 years earlier when his father's heart gave out on a Tuesday afternoon with a wrench still in his hand. I did not know, that first night, watching him stand near the dessert table not quite talking to anyone, holding a paper plate he hadn't touched, that his father had also left behind something else, a mountain of debt from a bad investment in a second shop location that failed within a year. Debt that Walter had quietly assumed as his own, debt that took him nearly a decade to pay off without ever once telling a soul in town that the Kessler name had come that close to losing everything. I did not know that yet. I only knew that he brought me a plate of food without being asked, because he had noticed I hadn't gotten up to get one myself, standing there in a group of women from the choir I didn't yet know, and that he had a particular way of listening, head slightly tilted, eyes steady, in no hurry to fill the silence, that made you feel, for the length of a conversation, like the only person in a crowded room. We were married 11 months later, in June of 1989, in the basement of that same church, on folding chairs, with a cake his mother made because we could not, he told me at the time, afford a bakery one. I did not think anything of that sentence then. I have thought of little else, some nights, since. I should say something here about how our marriage actually worked in its daily architecture. Because I think you need to understand the shape of it before you can understand how something so large could stay hidden inside it for 34 years. From nearly the beginning, money was a subject Walter handled the way some men handle grief, privately, efficiently, with a door closed firmly behind him and no invitation to knock. He paid the bills on the first of every month, sitting alone at the kitchen table with his checkbook and a cup of black coffee gone cold beside him. The radio turned low to a station that played nothing but old country standards, and he did not want help, and after a few early attempts to sit with him, bringing my own cup of coffee over, pulling out the chair across from his, I stopped offering. It became one of the quiet rituals of our marriage, the kind you don't examine too closely, because examining it would mean admitting something was strange about it. He handled the bills. I handled nearly everything else, the house, eventually the children, my own small teacher's salary that covered groceries and school clothes and not much beyond that. When I asked, every so often, whether we might afford this or that, a better car, a real vacation, new carpet for the living room instead of the same worn beige that had been there since we bought the house in 1990, he would give me some version of the same answer, delivered in the same even, unhurried voice. Times are tight right now. We should wait and see. Trust me, there's no money for that this year. I want to be fair to him, even now, even knowing everything I know, so I will say this plainly. We were never poor in any way that hurt us in an obvious sense. We had a modest, decent home on Chestnut Street, a white two-story with green shutters he repainted himself every few summers. Paid off years before other couples our age had cleared their mortgages, or so I believed. We ate well. We never once had the lights shut off, never once had a car repossessed, never once faced the kind of hardship that makes the neighbors talk. Our children, Daniel and Rebecca, never went without anything they truly needed, though they certainly noticed, growing up, that their friends had things they did not: cable television, name-brand sneakers instead of the ones from the discount store 2 towns over, a family trip to Disney World that never materialized no matter how many years running Rebecca asked for it as her one birthday wish, drawn in crayon, on the little wish list she made every February. Walter's answer to her, every single year until she stopped asking around age 11, was gentle but entirely unmoving. Not this year, sweetheart. Things are tight. Maybe someday, once things settle. There was an object in our house that I think of now as the first true motif of this story, though I did not understand it as one for a very long time. It was a small brass key, kept on Walter's key ring alongside his shop keys and his truck key, a key I asked about exactly once, in our 2nd or 3rd year of marriage, and never again after that. I found it strange even then. It did not fit any door I knew of in our life. It was too small and too finely cut, the kind of key that belongs to something with a lock built inside a bank vault rather than a house. When I asked him what it opened, over dinner one evening, casually, the way you ask about anything small and unremarkable, he closed his hand around the whole ring. Almost before I'd finished the question, a small reflexive motion I noticed, and then, over the following decades, trained myself not to notice. "It's nothing," he said. "Old key of my dad's. Never bothered to throw it out." I remember the particular quality of his voice when he said it, a fraction too quick, a fraction too smooth, in a tone that did not invite a follow-up question. The same tone he used when a customer at the shop tried to talk him down on a fair price. I filed that tone away somewhere I did not look at again for almost 30 years. The second motif was smaller and stranger, and I have thought about it more than almost anything else since he died. Once a month, always on a Saturday morning, Walter would rise before I was fully awake, dress quietly in the dark, and drive to the next town over. Not our town, always the next one, 20 minutes north on Route 9, to run what he called his errands. Alone, he was always back by 10, in time for the eggs and coffee I'd have ready. And he never brought anything home from these trips that I could see. No bags, no new tool for the shop, no receipt left on the counter, nothing at all to account for 2 hours of a Saturday morning spent somewhere he never named beyond the vague word errands. I asked him once, in our 5th or 6th year of marriage, over breakfast, why he didn't just run his errands here in Millbrook. And he told me, without looking up from his eggs, that the hardware store in the next town had better prices on shop supplies, and that it was worth the drive. It was a perfectly reasonable answer, delivered in a perfectly reasonable voice. I believed it for 28 years. The third motif, of course, was the coffee tin, and I want to say something more about it here, because I think it is the one piece of this story that was never actually hidden from me at all, and that fact has come to mean something different to me than I expected. Walter was, by nature, an unusually private man about money in a way that went well beyond ordinary frugality. Frugality is a philosophy, a set of habits you can discuss openly at the dinner table. What Walter practiced was something closer to a discipline, or a vigil, a nightly, weekly, monthly ritual of small, consistent acts of concealment so gentle and so steady that I never once, in 3.5 decades, thought to name it as concealment at all. I called it being careful with money. I called it Walter being Walter. The same way you'd describe a man who always parks in the same spot or always orders the same sandwich. I did not call it what it actually was, because I did not yet know what it actually was, and because he had built, brick by careful brick, a version of our life together in which that question never quite had room to be asked. The unspoken tension in our marriage, if you could even call it tension, because it was never a fight, never a raised voice, nothing so dramatic as that, lived almost entirely in the space around money, in what was not said, rather than what was. There was a particular quality to the silence that would settle over the kitchen table on the first of every month, while Walter sat with his checkbook and his cold coffee, that I learned early on not to interrupt. I would busy myself with something else in those hours, laundry, grading papers in the early years, later just a book I wasn't really reading, and I understood, without ever being told, that this was not a conversation I was invited into. I want to describe one particular evening from those years, because I think it captures the texture of the whole marriage better than I could explain it in the abstract. Rebecca was perhaps 9 years old, which would put it around 1998 or 1999, and Walter had come home from the shop later than usual, and quieter than usual. And after the children were in bed, I found him sitting alone on the back steps in the dark, not doing anything in particular, just sitting with his forearms resting on his knees, looking out at nothing. I sat down beside him on the cool concrete and asked what was wrong, and for a long moment he didn't answer at all, and I remember the crickets, and the porch light from the Hendersons' house next door, and the particular held stillness of him beside me. Then he said, in a voice I had rarely heard from him before, low, almost raw, nothing like his ordinary even tone, I just want you and the kids to never have to feel what I felt, growing up, watching my dad lose everything. I asked him what he meant, exactly, reaching for his hand in the dark, and he shook his head and said it wasn't important, that he was tired, that he was going to bed. I let it go, the way I had learned to let so many things go. I have thought about that night 1,000 times since he died, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath, finding new undersides of it every time. I understand now that it was the closest he ever came in 36 years to telling me the truth directly, and that I did not know how to hear it, because I did not yet know there was a truth beneath it to hear. My sister Carol, who has never in her life been shy about saying exactly what she thinks, was the one person who came closest to naming the strangeness of it out loud more than once over the years. She visited every few months from Harrisburg, and every visit, at some point over coffee at my kitchen table, the subject would come up in one form or another. I remember one particular afternoon. Rebecca must have been in middle school by then, so this would be somewhere around 2001, when Carol set down her cup, looked at me directly, and asked, "Ellie, do you actually know what's in your own bank account? Like, if I asked you right now, could you tell me a number?" I remember laughing it off, the way I always did, telling her that Walter was simply better with numbers than I was, that he handled it and I handled the rest, that every marriage divides its labor differently, and this was ours. "Doesn't that bother you, though?" she pressed, not knowing. "Not even a little." I told her it didn't, and I said it with such practiced ease that I believe I nearly convinced myself along with her. I did not let myself examine, in that moment or for many years afterward, why a woman with a college degree, a woman who balanced an entire second-grade classroom supply budget every September down to the penny, would defer so completely to her husband on a question as basic as what her own family was actually worth. Carol let it go that day, the way she always eventually did. But I remember the look on her face, not quite worry, but close to it, a kind of watchful patience, as though she were waiting for a door to open that never did. There was a private theory I developed, somewhere in the middle years of our marriage, that I want to share here, because I think it says something about how a person can live so close beside a mystery and still choose, again and again, not to solve it. I told myself that Walter's silence around money was really about his pride, that a man who had grown up watching his father fail publicly in a town small enough that everyone watched it happen would naturally develop a horror of ever being seen to struggle, and that his secrecy was less about hiding wealth and more about hiding the possibility of its opposite. I told myself that if things were ever genuinely difficult, he simply wouldn't want me to worry, and that this was, in its own way, a form of protectiveness I should be grateful for rather than suspicious of. I want to say, honestly, that this theory was not wrong. It simply was not complete. I had guessed at the shape of the iceberg without any sense at all of its size. And I had made peace with a smaller, more manageable version of the truth because it was the only version I had access to. The specific reason nothing about this ever changed, the honest, sympathetic constraint at the center of it all, which I did not fully understand until after Walter was gone, traced back to a single formative period in his childhood that he almost never spoke about directly. Walter's father, Earl Kessler, had opened a second repair shop location in the next county in 1974, borrowing heavily against the family's only asset, the original shop, to do it. The second location failed within 14 months, undone by a highway rerouting that diverted traffic away from it entirely, a piece of bad luck no amount of hard work could have prevented. What followed, in the Kessler household, was not bankruptcy exactly. Earl scraped and clawed his way through it, working double shifts, refusing to let the bank take the original shop, but it was, by Walter's own account, years of a particular kind of quiet terror that lived in that house every single night. Walter told me once, only once, in the early days before we married, sitting on my apartment steps with his arm around me, that he used to lie awake as a boy of 11 and 12, listening to his parents argue in low, tense voices through the thin wall of his bedroom, doing arithmetic out loud in the dark, trying to figure out which bill could wait another month and which one couldn't. He told me he had promised himself, lying there, that if he ever had a wife and children of his own, they would never lie awake the way his mother had, doing that same frightened arithmetic. I did not understand at the time that the promise he was making to himself was not simply a promise to work hard and provide, in the ordinary sense every young man makes. It was a promise to control the information itself, to make absolutely certain that whatever fear or uncertainty existed around our finances would live entirely inside him, contained, managed, and nowhere else in our house, ever, no matter what it cost him personally to carry it alone. There was one evening, in our 9th year of marriage, when this pattern came as close to being tested directly as it ever did, and I want to describe that scene in full, because I think it shows both people, him and me, choosing, without ever quite naming what they were choosing, not to cross a line neither of us could fully see. My cousin Diane had gotten into serious trouble that winter, a small business loan on her flower shop gone bad, threats from the bank about the house, a level of fear in her voice on the phone that frightened me too. I came to Walter that night, uncharacteristically direct for me, and asked him outright, sitting across from him at the kitchen table where he never liked to be asked such things, could we help her? Do we have anything at all we could spare? I remember the exact stillness that came over his face in that moment, the particular way his jaw set, the way his hand went still on the checkbook in front of him. He was quiet for what felt like a very long time, long enough that I almost took the question back, and then he said, evenly, "We don't have that kind of money, Ellie. I wish we did." And then, after another pause, looking not quite at me, but somewhere just past my shoulder, he added something I did not think much of at the time, but that I have replayed constantly in the months since his death. "If we ever did have more than we needed, you'd be the first to know. I promise you that." He wrote Diane a check anyway, a few days later, for $300, an amount that felt, at the time, like it was stretching us genuinely thin. I remember us discussing, briefly, whether we could really afford even that much. I did not know until 14 months after he died that the check he wrote my cousin came from a household with an account balance so large it could have covered her entire debt 3 or 4 times over without leaving even a visible dent. And that he chose the amount of $300 not because it represented the true limit of what we could spare, but because it was precisely the amount that would not raise a single follow-up question from me about where it had come from, or why there wasn't more. The years moved the way years do, when you are raising children and running a household and not asking the questions you have quietly, unconsciously trained yourself not to ask. Daniel graduated Millbrook High in 1999 and went off to a state university 2 hours away on a partial academic scholarship, the rest covered by loans that Walter insisted, gently but firmly, were simply the only realistic option available to us. Rebecca followed him 2 years later into a nursing program, also on loans, also with Walter's steady, apologetic insistence that this was, unfortunately, the way it had to be. I remember feeling a low, persistent guilt during those years, the particular guilt of a mother who cannot give her children what other families around them seem to give without a second thought, and I remember Walter absorbing that same guilt visibly, silently, in the set of his shoulders every single time the subject of tuition bills came up at the table. I understand now that his guilt was not the guilt of a man genuinely unable to help his children more. It was the guilt, I believe, of a man choosing, again and again, deliberately, to let his own family believe a story that was no longer true, because by then he did not know how, or perhaps could not bear to stop telling it. The shop itself did well over those years. Walter had a genuine gift for the work and a reputation across 3 counties for a kind of blunt, old-fashioned honesty that is rarer and more valuable than people fully appreciate in a business built on trust between strangers and their engines. By the time he was in his early 50s, he had 2 men working under him full-time and a waiting list most weeks that stretched out 10 days or more. Still, the answer to any question about money never changed in its essential shape, even as its particular justifications shifted with the times. "Business is unpredictable," he'd say, setting down his coffee cup. "You never know when a big repair bill's going to hit the tow truck, or a slow month's going to turn into 3 slow months in a row, and then where would we be?" Every reason he offered me, individually, was entirely reasonable on its own terms. It was only the accumulation of 30 years of reasonable reasons, laid one on top of another like the courses of a brick wall, that I would eventually come to recognize, far too late, as something else entirely, not a wall built to keep danger out, as I had always assumed, but a wall built just as carefully to keep a very particular truth in. I think often, now, about a smaller scene from this middle period, one I did not think much of at the time. Rebecca, home from nursing school for a weekend, maybe 20 years old, asked her father over dinner, half joking, whether he'd ever consider retiring early, taking it easy, letting the 2 men at the shop run things, while he and I finally took that trip to the ocean he was always promising. I remember the small laugh he gave, and the way he reached over and patted my hand on the table, and said, "Someday, sweetheart, when things settle." Rebecca rolled her eyes, the way 20-year-olds do, and said, "Dad, you've been saying that since I was in diapers." He laughed at that too, genuinely, and said nothing further, and the conversation moved on to something else. I did not notice, at the time, the particular quality of his silence in the seconds just before he laughed, a beat too long. A flicker of something crossing his face that I would have called discomfort if I had let myself look at it directly. I have thought of that beat many times since. I believe now it was the sound of a man weighing, for just a moment, whether this was finally the night he would tell the truth, and then deciding, as he had decided every other night before it, that it was not. When Walter was 58, his doctor found an irregularity in a routine blood test that led, over the following 8 months, to a diagnosis of a... I went to his office on a gray Thursday morning expecting the reading of a simple will, the house, the truck, the shop, the small insurance policy, matters I believed I already understood completely and had, in some numb, exhausted way, already made peace with. Arthur greeted me at the door with a gentleness I remember registering, even then, as slightly out of proportion to what I was expecting the meeting to hold. He had a folder in front of him on his desk, considerably thicker than I would have guessed necessary for a man of our modest means, and before he opened it, he looked at me for a long moment, folded his hands, and said, "Eleanor, I want to prepare you for what we're about to go through. Walter asked me a long time ago to make absolutely sure you understood everything when the time finally came for this conversation. I don't believe he ever told you the full picture of what he built. What followed was the longest hour of my life, and I want to try to render it here as it actually happened, in order, rather than simply summarize it, because I think the specific details are the only way to convey what it felt like to sit in that chair." Arthur opened the folder and began, methodically, almost gently, to lay documents out in front of me on the desk, one at a time. Bank statements I had never seen. Brokerage account summaries with account numbers I did not recognize. A second life insurance policy I had never once known existed. records for a safety deposit box at a bank in the very next town over, the same town Walter had driven to every single Saturday morning for 28 years. The key on his ring, Arthur said, watching my face carefully as he said it. The small brass one, that's the one that opens this box. I believe you may have asked him about it once. I felt something go very still and very cold in my chest at that. I had not told Arthur about the key. Walter had. Inside that box, Arthur explained, laying out photocopies as he spoke, were savings bonds Walter had purchased steadily since the earliest years of our marriage, a stack of them going back to 1990, small amounts at first, $50 here, $100 there, growing larger and more frequent as the shop grew more successful through the 90s and into the new century, until in the final decade of his life he had been purchasing them in amounts of $1,000 or more, several times a year, always in the same careful, deliberate hand, on the same kind of purchase form. There was a brokerage account, opened in 1998, the same year, I would realize later as that night on the back porch steps, that he had funded with small, regular monthly contributions for over 25 years and never once withdrawn a single dollar from. An account that had quietly compounded through every market rise and fall, he apparently tracked with an obsessiveness he never once mentioned to me, into a sum that made me put my hand flat against the cool wood of the desk to steady myself when Arthur finally said the number aloud. There was the second life insurance policy, not the small business one I already knew about, but a private one, taken out the same month Daniel was born in 1990, the premiums paid faithfully, without a single lapse. For 32 consecutive years, a policy worth considerably more than the house I had lived in my entire adult life. He set all of this up for me, I said, and it was not quite a question, more a sentence I needed to hear myself say aloud to believe it. Arthur nodded slowly. He talked about it, over the years, more than you might expect, he told me, folding his hands on the desk. He used to say, and I'm giving you this close to word for word, Eleanor, because he said some version of it to me more than once, sitting in that same chair you're sitting in now. I don't want her spending one single day of her life worrying about money. Not one day. Not even after I'm gone. He was terrified. Genuinely terrified of leaving you exposed the way his own mother had been exposed after his father's shop nearly went under when Walter was a boy. He told me once that his father's failure had taught him that the worst thing a man could do to the people he loved wasn't losing the money in the first place. It was letting them find out too late that there wasn't any left. Arthur paused, then, and added something more gently, almost as an aside, something I have turned over in my mind nearly every day since. He also told me more than once that he worried it wasn't entirely fair to you, keeping you in the dark the way he did, for so many years. He knew on some level that it wasn't quite right. But every single time he considered changing it, sitting you down, showing you everything plainly, something in him wouldn't let him do it. I think, in his own way, he needed to be the only one carrying the weight of it. I think it was the only kind of love he genuinely knew how to give, without ever asking for anything back in return. I did not cry in that office, not right away. I sat very still, looking at the columns of numbers spread across the desk in front of me, a sum that, when everything was finally added together across every account, every bond, every quiet, invisible deposit made one at a time over 34 years by a man who told me for 3.5 decades that there was no money, came to just under $800,000, and I felt something I can only describe now as a kind of vertigo. The sensation of an entire structure I had lived inside my whole adult life, quietly rearranging itself around me while I sat perfectly motionless in a chair. Every closed checkbook, every Saturday morning drive I had never once questioned past the first year. Every trust me, there's no money delivered in that same patient, unmoving voice across a table, a car, a hospital bed. It had all been true, in its own strange way, and also it had all been a door closed gently and deliberately for 34 years in front of a room I never even knew existed. I asked Arthur, before I left his office that day, why Walter had chosen to structure things this way at all. Why not simply tell me, at some point, once the fear had eased, once the shop was stable, once the children were grown? Arthur considered the question for a long moment before he answered. I asked him something close to that myself once, years ago, he said. He told me he'd thought about it constantly, especially after Daniel and Rebecca left for school. But by then, he said so much time had passed that telling you felt like it would raise more questions than it answered. He was afraid you'd feel, his word, not mine, betrayed. He said it was easier, in a strange way, to keep carrying it than to hand it to you all at once and watch your face, while you tried to understand 30 years of silence in a single conversation. I did not know, sitting in that office, whether that reasoning made me feel better or worse. I still do not know, fully, all these months later. I suspect both feelings are simply going to live inside me at once, from now on, and that I will have to learn to make room for both. I went home that afternoon and did something I had not done in years. I took the coffee tin down from the pantry shelf, carried it to the kitchen table, and poured its contents out onto the wood surface. All those quarters and folded dollar bills. The vacation fund we never once used, and I counted it slowly, by hand, the way you might count something simply to keep your hands occupied while your mind is somewhere else entirely, still standing in that lawyer's office, still hearing that number. It came to $1,140. It was, I understood as I counted it out in small, careful stacks. The only part of Walter's saving that had ever been visible to me across our entire marriage, the only piece of the iceberg he ever let break the surface of our shared life. A small, honest, almost playful gesture toward a future trip we both knew, somewhere underneath everything, we were probably never quite going to take. Sitting in plain sight on a shelf in our own kitchen the entire time. While the true weight of what he had actually built for me sat locked in a steel box 20 minutes north, one I did not have the key to until the man who held it was already gone. I called Walter's oldest friend, Frank Devereaux, a few days after that, because the two of them had grown up together on the same street, worked together at the shop for a stretch in their 20s, before Frank moved into insurance sales. And if anyone besides Arthur had ever known what Walter was quietly building, I suspected it would be Frank. We met at the diner on Main Street, the same one we had all gone to for 40 years, the same booth by the window where Frank told me the story, and I told him what I had learned, watching something soften and ache in his weathered face at the same time as I spoke. He told me, once, Frank said, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. Not quite meeting my eyes, back when the boys were still small, maybe 91 or 92. We were sitting right here, actually, this exact booth. He said he'd made a decision that he was never going to let you carry the fear he grew up carrying in that house on Larch Street. He said the safest thing he could possibly do for you wasn't to tell you everything was fine and hope it stayed that way. It was to make everything actually, genuinely fine, quietly, so completely and so thoroughly that you'd never have to test whether it was true. Not even once, not even in a bad year. Frank looked at me for a long moment, his eyes bright. I told him at the time I thought that was a strange way to love somebody, carrying the whole weight of it alone like that, year after year, and never letting her share it. He paused, and his voice dropped a little. He said maybe it was strange, but it was the only way he knew for certain it would hold. I have spent the months since that conversation revisiting so many small, ordinary moments from our marriage with entirely new eyes, turning each one over the way you'd turn over a familiar stone and find, for the first time, something written on its underside. The brass key, which I understand now, was never really about hardware or errands at all, but was, in its own quiet, physical way, the shape of every promise he was keeping without my knowledge, carried on the same ring as the keys to our truck and our shop, hidden in plain sight against my own carelessness for 30 years. The Saturday mornings, 28 years of them, which I now recognize not as errands in any ordinary sense, but as a kind of private vigil, a ritual of care performed entirely alone, for me, without an audience, without credit, without once being asked or expected to perform it. Even the checkbook on the first of every month, that closed door I learned so early not to knock on. I understand differently now, not as a wall he built to keep me out of our shared life, but as a burden he chose, deliberately and repeatedly across 34 years to carry entirely on his own shoulders, so that I would never once have to feel even a fraction of its true weight. I did go back to Arthur's office a second time, about a month after the first meeting, because there was one question I needed to ask him directly, one I had never quite managed to ask Walter himself while he was still alive to answer it. I asked Arthur, sitting across from him in the same chair, whether he thought Walter had done all of this, the decades of secrecy, the careful concealment maintained right up until the final weeks of his life, because he simply did not trust me. It was the fear that had sat underneath everything since that first meeting, the one I had not let myself say aloud even to Carol. Arthur was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with real care before he answered it. "I don't think it was ever about trust in you, Eleanor," he said finally. "I think it was about trust in the world itself." He didn't believe, deep down, that the world would ever let him fully rest financially, not after what he'd watched happen to his own family as a boy. And he simply wasn't willing to let that particular fear touch you, not for a single day, not even once in 36 years. I think, if anything, the secrecy itself was the most trust he was personally capable of extending to anyone. Trusting himself completely with the entire weight of something, so that you would never have to carry even a fraction of it. I am not certain, even now, that this fully resolves the question for me, and I don't believe it ever fully will. There is a version of this story where I am simply, purely grateful, and there is another version where I still feel, quietly, on certain evenings, the particular loneliness of having shared a bed with a man for 36 years, while an entire dimension of his inner life stayed locked behind a door I never once had the key to. I have come to believe that both of those things are true at the same time, and I have stopped trying, most days, to resolve them into one single clean feeling. Some things, I think now, are not meant to resolve neatly at all. They are only meant to be held, carefully, the way Walter held nearly everything. What I have decided to do with what he left me, in the end, feels like the truest and most honest answer I can give to the larger question of what all of it actually meant. I did not go anywhere lavish with it, though I certainly could have. I paid off Daniel and Rebecca's remaining student loans in full that spring, the very loans Walter always said, gently, apologetically, we simply could not help more with. And I watched both of my grown children cry on the phone, separately, in a way that told me they understood instantly, without my needing to explain a single word of it, exactly what that particular gesture was actually about. I set aside a portion of it to fund a small scholarship at the vocational school 2 towns over in Walter's name. For one student each year who wants to learn auto repair the way he once did, standing beside his own father in that same low brick shop on Route 9. Learning a trade that would eventually let him build, quarter by quarter, and bond by bond. An entire second life he never told a single soul about until it was too late for him to tell it himself. And I kept a portion of it simply to live on, comfortably, the way I understand now he always intended, though I notice, even still, that I find myself hesitating some mornings before spending money on something small and entirely unnecessary just for myself, an old habit, I suppose, built carefully over 34 years of believing there wasn't enough, one I doubt I will ever fully unlearn. Not completely, not even now. The coffee tin is back on its shelf, filled again, slowly, the way it always was. I have started dropping my own change into it, most nights before bed, the way he did for 34 years, not for any particular vacation I have concrete plans to take, though I might take one, eventually, alone or with Carol, somewhere warm. The way he always said we would once things finally settled down. I do it now because the ritual itself has come to mean something different to me than it ever meant while he was alive. It is the one place, the one small visible corner of this entire long story, where I finally get to see, plainly and completely, exactly what is being saved, and exactly why, with nothing at all hidden behind it. I think, in the end, that love takes more shapes than most of us are ever willing to admit, and that some of its deepest and truest forms are also its quietest, the ones that never announce themselves, that work steadily for decades in the dark corners of an ordinary life without ever once asking to be seen, or noticed, or thanked. I do not know, even now, whether I would have chosen, given the option at any point along the way, to live 34 years believing there was less than there actually was. I only know that the man who made that choice for me made it out of a love so total, so carefully and patiently constructed over the length of an entire marriage, that it outlived him by more than a year before I even understood it was there at all, sitting quietly in a locked box 20 minutes from my own kitchen table. I am still learning how to hold that knowledge. I suspect I will be learning how to hold it for whatever years I have left. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.